shot. I'm hoping it makes it through the next couple of minutes. I'm thinking I need to start figuring out what the real estate market is going to be. And of course, having lived in New York for the previous decade, I thought I was going to find a place where apartments would be cheaper. What a fool I was, of course. As I'm making my way on the F train back from Manhattan to Brooklyn, I'm getting more and more depressed looking at the real estate listings in Greater Boston when I came across the book section of that Sunday's Boston Globe. And what caught my eye was one of my old college professors who wrote a review. And it was one of those reviews that, I'm sure for the author, but for any reader who cares about American history, just simply took your breath away. Let me just read a few lines from that review that I still remember reading on that F train. The name of war escapes all the parochialisms that afflict so many historians. Her achievement in this book puts her in the company of our best contemporary prose stylists. That's one that has around 1,000 hits on Google these days. Shaped by a transformative and original imagination. And then the last one, this is history as it should be written. Immediately I ran to the community bookstore on 7th Avenue in Park Slope, picked up the book on that Sunday, I remember, and read it later in the course of that day. It was just a stunning work to look at, to think about, to imagine how it had been put together, especially as I had in the back of my mind that Barry O'Connell, the reviewer in question, was not a particularly easy-to-please professor back in the day at Amherst College a decade earlier. So I jumped at that book, looked at it, it immediately informed the way that I taught and continue to teach early American history, whether in the American Civilization Survey or in other settings from graduate seminars on down. It really has fundamentally altered, I think, the way not just myself, but a number of folks trained in the 1990s and this decade have conceived of and introduced our students to the study of early America. Professor Jill Lepore, currently at Harvard University, the author of that book, The Name of War, a groundbreaking study of King Philip's War of the 17th century, has gone on over the last decade to publish 2 additional monographs. The first, A is for American, Letters and Other Characters in the Newly United States. And then last year, 2005, New York Burning, Liberty, Slavery, and Conspiracy in 18th Century Manhattan. The latter book, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize this past spring. What stands out across these books, beyond the kind of writing that someone like Barry O'Connell pointed to in that almost 9-year-old review in the Boston Globe, is the remarkable breadth of coverage, the historical imagination that scans, moves so easily across the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, avoiding the kind of parochialism that O'Connell writes of, looking in odd corners, looking across the map, looking across the societies of colonial, revolutionary, and early national America. And beyond all, I think what holds it together, and certainly has given her a place in the New Yorker over the last couple of years, is a prose style, a kind of literary imagination that is distinctive in contemporary nonfiction, and serious literary nonfiction. Educated at Tufts nearby and at Yale for her PhD, currently professor of history at Harvard University, founder of Commonplace, one of the most wonderful websites out there over the last decade, not just for people interested in history, but for kind of intellectual life more broadly. A regular contributor, as I mentioned, to the New Yorker. Lepore is single-handedly reminding the historical profession, and I would argue the academy more generally, that there is a public audience, a public need for the kind of work that academics do. So please join me in welcoming Jill Lepore to Boston College.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David, and thank all of you for being here this evening. It's always hard to follow up that kind of an introduction, in which I'm charged with somehow saving the Academy from itself. I have very modest aims for this evening, which is that I wanted to talk a little bit about evidence, and not about writing, but about evidence. And I think that's something that we don't talk enough about in the Academy, and that we don't talk precisely enough about. And what I want to talk about tonight is what I call the asymmetry of evidence. What drew me to the last project that I worked on, this book that was published last year, was actually the impracticality of the project. And I think all of the work that I've done, I've been drawn by kind of, mission impossible mentality that I bring with me to my intellectual work. And that is to sort of find something to write about that other people have tried to write about and quit. And this project, which is about an alleged slave rebellion in New York City in 1741, has not been very widely written about. And I don't think very many people have gotten to the heart of the matter because there are fundamental problems that plague the evidence. It's the case that most people who have lived on this planet in the time that there have been human beings on this planet have left no documentary evidence whatsoever. It's easy in our sort of hyped up information age to think that everybody leaves a documentary trail behind, a diary, sets of letters, blogs, whatever. But in human history, obviously, most people have left exactly nothing. And in the history of America, of the United States and the colonies that became the United States, that is also the case. And it's been my observation that as much as historians in the last few decades have been deeply and passionately committed to trying to incorporate the inarticulate, people who left no documentary trail behind, into their narratives of American history, they haven't always been successful. Because to some degree, calling whole classes of people, that is largely people who don't know how to read and write, or people who don't speak a language that has a written form, calling them inarticulate sort of accepts their lack of documentary trail rather than questioning it and rather than pushing back against it. And I've been particularly interested for years now in thinking about how the problem of evidence affects what we know about slavery. And that's what I'd like to speak about tonight in the context of this particular project. And it's something that's illustrated awfully well in this image, the credit of which is here. This is a portrait from Albany, New York in 1730. And it illustrates pictorially, in part, the point that I'm trying to make. And that is this young Dutch child is at the very center of this portrait and takes up most of its space. And in the background, there's this black man, probably enslaved, possibly a servant, who very much recedes into the background. And although he's very specifically portrayed here, he has a kind of anonymity in this portrait and a kind of voicelessness in this portrait that's reflected in the documentary trail that you find if you go to the archives in New York State or in any of the northern states and former colonies where slavery was predominant. And what was important to me in tackling a project that involved slavery was working hard to restore symmetry to the evidentiary base. So what I want to do tonight is first tell you the story of this alleged slave rebellion in New York City in 1741. It's kind of a good story, and mostly it's a mystery. And I'm a huge fan of detective fiction. So I always buy into the fantasy that I have this Holmesian relationship to evidence. And you'll see, as I tell you what I did in my research to try to solve the mystery, you'll see, and I hope you can attend to the ways in which my particular research methods were aimed at addressing this problem of the asymmetry of the evidence at hand. So what happened in New York City in 1741, picture New York, just the southern tip of Manhattan Island. Maybe you've never been to New York. You have in your mind's eye a picture of New York. Throw that away. Think instead of like Plymouth Plantation. We're talking about 1741. New York does not look like Plymouth Plantation, but it looks a lot more like that than it looks like the Manhattan that you have visited. It's a small island. There are 10,000 people living in New York in 1741, Dutch and English. It's a busy, busy, busy port city. 2,000 of the residents of New York are Africans who were enslaved. So 1/5 of the population is enslaved. It's the largest percentage of slaves north of North Carolina, north of Virginia, north of Maryland. New York City is a slave city. It was built by slaves, and slaves supplied the chief labor for that port during all of the crucial decades of its economic development. So imagine this dense, bustling 18th century city. 10,000 people, 2,000 of them slaves. In the winter of 1741, beginning in March, over the course of 3 short weeks, there were 10 fires. New York is a dense city. It is also a wooden city, as are most 18th century cities. There's a process that takes place over the course of the 18th century that is called stonification, which means dense cities moving to sort of pass laws that require all the buildings have to be built in stone. Because the danger of fire in these densely settled port cities along the Atlantic was so great. Whole cities were born. The London Fire, the Great London Fire of 1666, 13,000 buildings burned to the ground. There's just a tremendous fear of fire in this city. And in 3 short weeks in the winter of 1741, there were 10 fires in Manhattan. And no one died, but the fires were devastating. And the very first building that was set on fire was in the fort, the very tip of the island, which is the city's chief defensive outpost. And this at a time when England is at war is at war with France and will soon be at war with Spain. So the city is left defenseless by the fire that takes place at the fort. And the city immediately rouses all of its forces to undertake an investigation. Are these fires mere coincidence? Is this just a question of it was a tough winter, the woods dried out in the buildings, maybe some of them were chimney fires. There was a plumber fixing the roof of the fort, and he had a soldering iron, and maybe he spilled it. And there are all kinds of explanations that are offered for the fires. But eventually, it's determined that the Supreme Court of the province should convene a grand jury to conduct an investigation. And the grand jury first meets in April. The fires are in March. The grand jury meets in April. And over the course of a few short weeks initially, the grand jurors become convinced that the fires were all deliberately set, and that they were set by black men, by African slaves living in the city, who were in fact not just setting a few fires, but had an elaborate plot in which they were participating, in which they planned to burn the entire city of New York and kill every white person, and elect a slave who was their leader, a man named Caesar, the governor, and a white man who was a tavern owner, the new king of New York, this guy named John Hewson. So over the course of the summer of 1741, nearly all the adult black men in New York are thrown in a dungeon in the basement of City Hall, where they're left and interrogated daily, possibly tortured, and threatened with execution if they fail to confess, to pledging to join this plot. And in order to confess to pledging to join this plot, in order for your confession to work, you have to name other people. So you need to say, yes, I swore to a plot to burn the city down, and my friends Fred, Joe, and Tom were involved. And if you name enough people, and the people you name have not already been arrested, your life will be spared. But if your confession is insufficiently detailed or at variance with the other confessions, or if you don't name enough people, or if the people you name are not high quality enough from the point of view of the grand jury, you'll be burned at the stake. If you name some people and are somewhat helpful but not helpful enough, you'll be hanged. And if you offer a very good confession, you'll be shipped to the Caribbean, where you'll shortly die, given the conditions. So you can imagine the quality of these confessions has been suspect over the years. I think you can guess that by any contemporary legal standard, they're exactly useless. And as it turned out, by the end of the summer, when the conspiracy wrapped up and the court adjourned by the end of August, 13 black men were burned at the stake. To crowds of thousands of New Yorkers flocked to watch these executions, as was always the case with public executions in the 18th century. 17 black men were hanged, and 4 whites were also hanged, the alleged ringleaders of the plot. It may not escape your attention that this is one of the most devastating such episodes in all of early American history, and also one of the least known. So, for instance, the Salem witchcraft trials in 1692, only 20 people died and they were hanged. One was pressed to death. One more died in jail. The number of people who died in New York is far greater, and the ways in which they were executed and the way they were treated while they were in prison is far more atrocious. And yet this event is very little known, in spite of the fact that the third justice of the Supreme Court of New York, a man named Daniel Horsmanden, kept track of every single scrap of paper having to do with the investigation. And 3 years later, published it in this document, which is a printed book. This is the title page of it. It's 250 pages long. And it's called The Journal of the Proceedings and the Detection of the Conspiracy Formed by Some White People in Conjunction with Negro and Other Slaves for Burning the City of New York in America and Murdering the Inhabitants. So you might say, well, gosh, how come no one's ever heard of this event in New York City in 1741 if we have all the trial proceedings? What this document contains is 250 pages of depositions, confessions, eyewitness testimony, courtroom transcripts, courtroom testimony, the closing and opening statements of all the lawyers, the verdicts for everyone who's arrested, witnesses who come in support of the defense and in support of the prosecution for each and every trial, affidavits. It is every scrap of paper that survives to do with this elaborate series of several months' worth of legal proceedings. So why is it that no one really knows about this? There are a few reasons, mostly having to do with no one really caring for a long time. And then when historians started caring about slavery, and maybe actually caring particularly about the story of slavery in the North and uncovering it, most historians decided that this journal, this 250 pages of courtroom evidence and the confessions, over half of the slaves who were arrested confessed in the end, and 90 of them were shipped to the Caribbean. Most historians have said this stuff is basically valueless, right? Remember, these are guys, they're in a dungeon, they've been separated from their families, they've seen, they've smelt the burning flesh of their friends who are being burned not very far away from where they're being confined. Probably many of them have become very sick. They've been in this dungeon for months in the heat of the summer in New York City. The jailkeeper in the dungeon has been imprisoned before for having siphoned off money that he was supposed to be using to buy food for prisoners. So he's not a likely good caretaker for them. The chance that they have been beaten is very high. In Antigua a few years before this, in 1736, black men who were arrested in a similar conspiracy were broken on the wheel and roasted alive. So the chance that these men in New York were very badly treated is undeniable. And so historians have said, okay, we have a lot of documents about this event, but they're all from the prosecution's point of view, and therefore they're useless, and therefore we can't actually draw any conclusions about this. We can write about it and we can narrate. In some ways, to say that is to not get beyond the moral outrage that we bring to this story. And to not get beyond that to any reconsideration of the evidence to hand. It's to look at this painting and to be passive before it, I think, is to hold that book of courtroom documents and say, wow, that was very bad, but we can't know what really happened. So there are more limiting factors than just the fact that the published documents are all from the prosecution's point of view. And ironically enough, one of the limiting factors is that in 1911, the Capitol building in Albany burned down, and that's where all the original manuscripts to all these confessions and all the attorney general's papers and the judge's notes, everything was burned, and the documents are in about this condition. So there's some useful text to be taken here and compared with the printed version, but there's not much. There's nothing in newspapers. None of these, very few of these slaves were literate, and those that were, we have nothing written by them that survived. There are very few letters from other New Yorkers describing what they've seen. Really all we have is that printed set of documents that's edited by this member of the Supreme Court. So, and the value of that I want to just kind of talk about very briefly before I talk about what my approach is to dealing with this problem. The value of that, or the lack of value of that, is sort of revealed here. Here, this is just a detail from a page of that Journal of the Proceedings. This is this one guy, Jack, who was owned by a Dutch cooper named Gerardus Comfort. And this is what Jack's confession looks like in the printed version. That a little after New Year, on a Monday about 4 p.m, Ben, Captain, he said, and then it's all in quotes. And there's a footnote here, and this is the only place where this kind of thing appears, actually, in the whole 250 pages, that says, Jack's description of Ben: his master live in tall house Broadway, Ben ride to fat horse. And this is the editor's attempt to explain to the reader in a kind of wink, wink, nod, nod, that Jack actually spoke in a very thick dialect. And it sounds to our ears like a Jamaican dialect or some kind of West Indian dialect. His master ride the fat horse. As it turns out, this confession of Jack's, which looks like this goes on for several pages. Jack was a crucial eyewitness testimony. Jack had already been condemned to be burned at the stake when he offered this confession. He had pled not guilty initially. And after his sentencing, he walked up to the front of the City Hall Supreme Court room and said to the 3 men that were the Supreme Court justices, actually there were only 2 on the bench that day, and said to them, I don't want to die, I will confess. And he then spent 3 days confessing. And 4 different people were brought in as interpreters because no one understood a word that Jack said. He spoke with a very thick dialect. And so the sons-in-law of his owner were brought in, various other people were brought in across town. And over the course of those 3 days, who knows what went on by way of coercion in extracting from Jack this particular confession that has particular features, especially that he names a lot of names. And of course, everybody he names is immediately arrested the next day. And most of the people he names will go on to die. So there really is a problem with how we understand whether, it says he said here, but did Jack say this? I mean, do we have any reason to believe that Jack said? This is the problem that historians have with this document. Fortunately, the governor, lieutenant governor of New York, was so concerned about how his supervisors in England would feel about this whole scandal and this alleged plot and these horrendous executions, that he had an amanuensis make copies of some of the confessions and had them sent to London, where they were housed in a variety of archives and where they still exist and were not burned. So there are some manuscript versions of Jack's confessions that can be compared against the later printed original. But I think we all agree that historians have been right to say, boy, these confessions are coerced. They don't meet a legal standard of evidence in today's society. They barely met a legal standard of evidence at the time. Arguably, they didn't meet any standard of evidence at the time. And they don't meet our professional standards as historians for what we can actually use to find out what happened. So we have to throw them out and say, it's too bad, this is an important event, but we can't actually know what happened. Now I want to talk about why I decided that this was a mission impossible that I really wanted to work on. My contrary nature led me to think, well, there's got to be some way to do something with these documents, because actually we have so few written words by 18th century slaves that I just felt like we couldn't afford to throw them all away. There's got to be something useful. There's going to be something that we can extract from these documents that can meet a standard of evidence, some way to redress that asymmetry in what survives. And so the main question, though, that you're confronted with in making that first claim that there is some way is you kind of need to get in this room, right? I mean, imagine Jack, Jack, Comfort's slave, for 3 days in the basement of City Hall being interrogated by a number of different people, a number of different translators in the room. Someone is writing something down, at the end of which he puts an X on it or something, at the end of 3 days of what kind of hell he went through, we don't know. But he is getting his freedom. This is an image from 1817. It's an abolitionist tract, and you can see what's going on here in this representation is that this guy is essentially telling his story in exchange for his freedom. I mean, the shackles on his feet and the cuffs on the mantle they're placed here to tell us that this runaway slave is telling his story to an abolitionist who's going to report it. But what he's trading is this, your story or your life, your story or your freedom. And where we stand as readers of Jack's confession, we don't want to actually stand behind this guy on the right looking over his shoulder and seeing what he's writing down. We somehow want to get to the other side of the room. I mean, basically, that's the maneuver that I'm trying to talk about. What is someone researching this problem can I do with this confession that moves me from one side of the room to the other? So I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I tried a lot of different things. And most of them failed, actually. And I'm going to talk about some of the ones that failed. I'm not going to talk about most of the ones that failed, because that actually takes a really long time. But this is the thing. This is the one thing that was actually a turning point for me. Just spending days looking at these courtroom, this set of documents. What am I going to do with this? How can I bring meaning to this? How can I get to the other side of the room? And the very last, 10 pages or so of that Journal of the Proceedings and the Detection of the Conspiracy is a list. This list, a list of Negroes committed on account of the conspiracy. It's just like a helpful little appendix at the back of the book so that you can figure out, who all was arrested and whatever happened to them. It's mainly, for documentary purposes. The court actually kept a docket like this for their own purposes. But if you were a New Yorker and you bought the book, you might want to look up your own, your neighbors and what happened to their slaves. It has this kind of helpful, handy tip kind of role in the book itself. And I looked at this list and I thought, well, that's interesting. I have a list like that myself because I'd been keeping such a list, and I, looked to see if my list had errors or this list had errors, and just kind of checking it factually. And then one day I was looking at this list and I thought, the list is long. It goes on for many pages because there are hundreds of black men arrested. This is the best surviving census of the slave population of a northern city that we have. If I think about this list not as a list of who was arrested and what happened to them, but as a census of the adult male slave population of this city, well, then it's actually really useful because there are no other censuses at all. There's nothing. There's no named census before 1755, and the one that exists for 1755, all the records from New York were mysteriously lost. So I then, this was a real turning point for me, because I then thought, all right, I'm going to put aside the question of were these confessions coerced, or is there anything true in the confessions? What do the confessions mean? How can I get to the other side of the room? And I'm actually just going to try to build the room. I'm going to just try to understand the world these people lived in. And when I've done that, maybe when I go back and read the confessions, they'll say something different to me. And so I then set about doing what is the bulk of all my work on this project, and which was a huge amount of fun, but also immensely frustrating. I set about trying to reconstruct the city of New York in 1741. This is a great image of the harbor. You can see this is what's underrepresented here is the density of ships that would have been in the harbor. People said that the masts rose up like a forest of trees in the harbor. There's such a busy economy, such a bustling metropolitan center. But you get a sense of the size of the city here. It's this dense city. By 18th century standards, it's extremely tall. New Yorkers didn't want to move up the island. It was best to be down by the water, down by the tip of the island. So it's dense, people are building upwards already, just it's very much like the New York of today in that regard. People wanted to build up right away. That was the best way to use your small plot of real estate. So buildings are 5 and 6 stories high, which is another problem for fire, because firefighters can't fight buildings that are that tall. So I looked at images of New York and looked at maps, and there are some great maps. This is a map depicting New York in 1742. It was actually made in 1813 by a man who was 4 years old when the New York Slave Rebellion took place, and he talks about, on the back of the map where he's scrawled some notes, he talks about having watched slaves burned at the stake, and he's got little notations for where he saw those burnings. It was clearly a defining piece of his childhood and a big part of why he decided to draw a map depicting New York at just this moment. And I spent a lot of time looking at these maps and trying to figure out where everything was in the city and where all these buildings were and what they looked like. And then I used a map-making tool, set of software that allowed me to build maps of New York on in space, in layers, on a kind of GIS plot. And so here, the black outline here is the outline of the settled part of New York in 1741 overlaid onto my AAA map from my glove compartment of New York as it is now. And the point of this map, the reason I just showed you, especially for those of you who know anything about New York, is that the New York island that existed that was settled is about a half a mile wide by a mile long at this point. It's a very small place, very dense, 10,000 people in this very small place. But most of what you think of now as Lower Manhattan is actually landfill. So that's much later. You can see the former World Trade Center here. But you can see Broadway going up on this map, on my glove compartment map. Broadway is the same Broadway now as it was then. So I'll talk about Broadway in a minute. But I spent a lot of time working with these overlays because New York City in the 18th century, then as now, was divided into wards. Here's another, that same overlay on an 18th century map. And everything political and economic was done by ward. You voted by ward, you were taxed by ward, your whole social life was organized into these wards. And one of the things that survives in New York City are tax lists up to 1734. And the tax lists are actually great because I had this map software and I put all these maps in it, and then I started building these databases that interacted with the maps. And I started making databases of the tax lists, because they have everybody's names on them and what kind of place they live in and how much they're going to be taxed for and what ward they live in. And the way that tax collectors collected taxes in 1734 was they walked from house to house. So knock, knock, Mr. Lerting, oh, you have 4 houses here, I'm going to charge you, 110 pounds. Next door, Mrs. Hawkins, oh, you live with Robert Lerting. Okay, well, you own nothing, I'm going to charge you 5 pounds for tax. Okay, next door, Edward Hicks, and they would just go up and down the street. So if you're next to somebody on the tax list, you are neighbors with them, or you're a tenant of theirs. So the tax lists offer all kinds of interesting information. And then into that database, there's 2,000 people. Every year there's a tax list. So I put a couple tax lists into my database, 2,000 people. Next year, 2,000 people, just to see if people moved from one year to the other. And then I had in my database, another whole part of the database, which was from the list of slaves who were arrested, the names of all their owners. So John Marshak owns a slave who's arrested, who I think has actually killed. David Clarkson owns a slave who's arrested. These guys are pretty much next door neighbors. Then I can know that these two guys are neighbors. Then when I read their confessions, eventually I can ask, well, did they name each other in their confessions? Because if they did, maybe they hung out together. Because I know that their owners paid taxes adjacent to one another or near one another. So I spent, years doing this minute work of entering tax lists. And then I spent a lot of time trying to find travel accounts and descriptions of the city. I kind of knew where everybody lived, and I knew where the slaves lived because I knew where their owners lived, and I knew what ethnicity their owners were, and I could find out, because other scholars had done this work, what occupation their owners had. So now if you confessed, maybe all I at first knew about you was your name was Antonio and your owner's name was John Marshak, but now I know John Marshak was an alderman from the East Ward and he was a baker and he lived next door to David Clarkson, whose slave Rutgers also confessed. That's like I can build up, so piece by piece, that the world becomes a little more detailed. And so I did the same thing with physical descriptions of the city and images of the buildings. And this is a detail from that map I showed you just a couple minutes ago. And I had this idea, this is one of the failed pieces of my work, but it's important to talk about failure. I had this idea that what I would do, I would have this long list of taxes, 2,000 names. And since it went door to door, that I could kind of lay it out like a string of pearls on these buildings. There are 1,100 buildings in the city. And I'd be able to figure out where every single person lived, along in these blocks. I never was able to do that. That was insane. But it would be really great if someone did it, because I like the idea that you could figure out where everybody lived in a city, that many years ago. It was very appealing. This is the tip of the island. You can see the fort here. That's what's burned down. You can see Broadway going up. Anyway, then I could do all that. There is some census data, not by name, but there are these returns that are sent to England where the lieutenant governor has to report how many slaves are in each ward. And so I was able to put the census, the closest census to 1741 is from 1737. So I could do things like this and say, okay, well, the slaves don't all live in one part of town, but they mostly live along the docks, along the docks of the East River. And that's where where most whites live too. They kind of live in equal proportion to one another. But that also happens to be the wealthiest part of town, because that's where you really want to live if you're a merchant. You want to live right near the docks. But then now I knew where everybody lived, like at least what ward you lived in. I knew who your near neighbors were. I knew what your owner did, and all these other pieces of information. Then I thought I would use all my great data in my database and my maps to say, well, what are the patterns? Okay, because we can't believe the confessions, but that the confessions happened, we do know, and that certain people named certain other people, we do know. So I did a lot. I spent months and months and months doing this kind of thing, plotting the slaves who were accused against the slaves who were accusers. So the red versus green, and it's all bunk, because you can sort of see here that the red and green are sort of equally distributed throughout the city in proportion to the population. So in other words, there's not like an obvious geographic pattern to whether, it's not like in the Salem witchcraft trials, this classic study suggested that all the accusers came from one side of town and one side of the Ipswich Road, and all the accused came from the other. It kind of unraveled the whole the mystery of Salem witchcraft. I was hoping I would find that out, but I got nothing. So I had a lot of things like this where I looked for patterns and I didn't find any. This is just to show that the tax assessment rolls, you can tell the average tax assessment is highest in this East Ward. This is where the wealthy merchants lived, where the most slaves lived, because the wealthier you were, the more slaves you had. That's something I can demonstrate very easily with these various tools. So, then I went and I have all these I have many layers on these maps. I have layers for streets and layers for parks and layers for sources of water, layers for taverns, churches, whatever. And I spent a lot of time. It's like a video game, playing with like putting the layers on and taking them off, and putting the people on and taking them off, and putting the white population on, and charting the white population against the taverns, and the Irish against like the French against the churches. And I spent a lot of time looking for patterns. But actually, the whole, it turned out, I didn't find many patterns, although I did find some. What happened, though, was that my means became my end. So that all this work that I did, figuring out who lived where and who their neighbors were and what occupation they had and were they wealthy or not wealthy, were they wealthier than their neighbors, where did they go to get their meat and where did they buy their slaves, and actually I thought I was going to find some great pattern that would unravel the whole mystery for me, but what I found was that I've had actually gotten to know New York. So that by the end of all that work, I knew the city really well. And when I read the confessions, I knew what everybody was talking about and where they were talking about having stood and what that might have felt like on the street and what that would have been in their line of sight. So what I really wanted to do, though, was escape this man. This is Daniel Horsmanden, who is the third Supreme Court Justice of the Supreme Court of the Colony in the province of New York, who's the guy who compiled all the legal documents and printed them in 1744. And he's a horrible man. And I had spent a lot of time getting to know about him. And I found, to my dismay almost, that it was very easy to find out things about Daniel Horsmanden. It was very easy to find out everything about Daniel Horsmanden. You know, his great-grandparents and, you know, what color they like, what kind of yarn they like to knit with. I mean, you could find out everything about this man. He came from, you know, a very well-established English gentry family, and he happened to have been the boon companion of a famous Virginia slaveholder named William Byrd, who spent many years in London in his ill-spent widowhood, taking Daniel Horsmanden to prostitutes in the parks of London. And in Byrd's diary, Danny Horsmanden and I went to the park again, and we found 2 women, and then we got drunk. And so I know everything. I know each night of his young life, what he was doing. Things that I'm sure he wishes I did not know. But in other words, I felt that I was going to Herculean efforts to find out about, you know, Antonio and John Marshak, his owner, and all I could find out was Marshak, and by there I could find out about. It took me, you know, a day to find out who Daniel Horsmanden slept with in 1721. So it was the asymmetry was really striking, and I wanted so much to put him aside, or to write a book that could account for him, but put him in the same world as these people who appear only as names on a list. And again, to find a way to use the Journal of the Proceedings. And there are many ways in which I was ultimately able to use the journal. I think, as I've hinted, principally what the work that I did with all that research in the database and the maps was give me a set of tools with which to tell the story with a level of vividness and detail that was important to me, and I thought was sort of restorative to the story, both about Horsmanden, but more about the world that slaves lived in. But I never did find that smoking gun, that pattern that I was looking for, that it would explain everything. I did find a number of things that are more subtle, and in a way, the whole project was about, for me, learning that actually, as much as I think it's wrong to say, oh, the evidence is not there, I can't bother to tell that story, that doesn't mean even if you work really hard, you can actually find the smoking gun. But there are a number of things that were really important to how I understood what happened in 1741. And the biggest one had to do with the source of water supply, of drinking water in Manhattan. Drinking water in Manhattan, then as now, if you've spent much time in New York, is not that good. And it has to do with the granite that the island sits on. And it's a city, water everywhere, but never a good cup to drink. New Yorkers didn't drink cold water, or just water that they would get from a well. People didn't drink water. It was just not a beverage you would have. You would be known to get sick from it. But even when horses came to New York, from New Jersey, they would drink the water and they would get really sick. So this is a source of great embarrassment to New Yorkers. No one from New Jersey is laughing at that, but I love that picture of the New Jersey horses getting sick when they come to New York. But what people did drink was tea, and it was the English gentleman's drink. And to drink tea, you have to have pretty good tasting water, because there's not much else taste to tea, as far as I'm concerned, but the water. So what a lot of slaves did, these are the adult men, the very slaves who are going to be accused in the conspiracy, what they did with their time, first thing in the morning, last thing at night, and often through the day, was go to the water pumps on the outskirts of town. They would drag these kegs or sledges, barrels, they'd roll out there, fill up, get their water filled up, and bring it back to their masters in the fancy part of town in the East River for their mistresses and masters to make their tea. And when you read the confessions, turns out there's 2 kinds of confessions. There's the confessions that follow the script that the prosecution clearly elicited. I went to John Huston's tavern, this Irishman who lived in the outskirts of town. I got drunk and he convinced me to burn the city down, and I did, and then I saw 12 different friends there, and here are their names, and please don't kill me. And then there were the confessions that said, well, I went to get water at Jack's house. And while I was there, Sandy told me about his neighbor Diana, whose mistress took her newborn baby and put it out in the snow to die last night. And I said, God damn those white people, I'm going to burn the city down. And that's the kind of confession the prosecution did not want. And they don't actually make use of it. If you offer up that kind of a confession initially, you have to confess again. And you have to eventually be willing to confess. I went to John Huston's tavern, and I got drunk. And John Huston convinced me to join the plot. And John Huston, I think I have that map back there, lived next door. John Huston was this poor Englishman who was a smuggler. No one lives at this part of town on what was then the North River, now the Hudson River. John Huston lived out there. He had a tavern. He sold drinks to slaves. Black men would go there all the time. He lived next door to Jack, or Gerardus Comfort's house. Gerardus Comfort didn't actually live in his house. He lived in a nice fancy house in the city, but he had a house up there where he kept all his slaves, where they did all of his work. So actually, what I concluded by looking at the variance between these two sorts of confession, one of which was clearly more useful to the prosecution than the other, is that actually there was a story that the prosecution needed the slaves to tell for certain reasons. And then there was a story that the slaves actually told that was true, that was rejected. And the story that they told was, this life is really hard. And one of the few comforts we have is when we get to hang out, when we go to get water at the edge of the city, and there are no white people there, and we get to complain about the horrendous atrocity that is our lives. And we get to fantasize about burning the city down, and we talk about that all the time. And that actually comes across as very genuine and very real in the confessions. And when you think about the geography, there happens to be a completely other situation involving very particular political circumstances of New York, the very particular partisan alliances of Daniel Horsmanden, who leads the whole investigation, that have to do with prosecuting John Huston and making these slaves these slaves' confessions do double duty in the advancing his own political career. So my principal conclusion, having done all the work and then looked back at the city and reread the confessions, is that there really was a conspiracy, but it was a very different kind of conspiracy than the scripted conspiracy that you had to confess to, because that script served much bigger political purposes for the courts than it did having anything to do with race in New York. And I'm delighted to take questions and talk more about any of this. The story has many layers I haven't gotten into, but I want to leave you with one final piece, and that is, I mentioned early on that it's frustrating that the original court documents were burned in 1911 when the Capitol building in Albany burned down. And the only way to corroborate Horsmanden's edited version of the court transcripts, the printed version of that 1744 thing, are the lieutenant governor copied out some of the confessions and sent them to England. So I went to England and I read all the confessions, and then I compared them to the printed ones. And there are very few departures. I mean, Horsmanden was a very careful editor. Whatever version he was looking at was very close to the one that was sent to England. And he didn't make many changes. Very, very, very few changes. And that was interesting. But it meant that the changes that were made were all that more telling. And here's one. In the confession of a man named Cato, he said, after having confessed, oh yes, we talked about burning the city down, and we're going to make Caesar governor, and then we're going to marry all the white women, and then he says, but we were only joking. And Horsmanden, when he copied this out and had it printed in his printed version, just deleted the phrase. And there are two other places where similar playfulness is hinted at. And you got the sense that the plot that I believe did exist, where these guys are, at the water pump at Jack's house, talking about the hell that is their lives, and they miss their wives, and a lot of their complaints are about their wives. I mean, that's a very genuine water cooler complaint. And they talk about burning the city down. That actually, it is in large part a blowing off steam thing. They are actually maybe only joking, or some of them are only joking, or they're participating in a kind of sociability that is very human and very important and really important to recover, but has nothing to do with the agenda of Daniel Horsmanden. And that's why I want to end here, because it's one of the few pieces of this story that I think does, take us to the other side of that room. So, thank you.